Hi, we're back now with Craig Milewski, talking about these these relationships between the humanities and the sciences. And Craig, the you know our institutions are often divided up by these disciplines. Okay, and we understand why we do this because, of course, we have to focus on those skills in that particular thing to gain that knowledge, right, and to gain those skills to continue to do research and all of that. But the downside of that is that the biology room is on that end of the building, and the English and humanities room is over here, and then probably in some schools, some K-12 schools, the music room is in the basement, right? And because of our schedules, all those teachers, all those people who are passionate about what they know, and want to learn more, want to be better, right? Our institutions make it hard for them to talk to each other and collaborate. Okay, and it seems like what we're looking at here, okay, with the Redemption Center project is that we're, and also in environmental humanities in general. Okay, we're looking at this meeting point, okay, between the humanities disciplines and the sciences. How are the ways that you navigate through that?
Well, I would describe it this way. We do often we think of the natural sciences as separate from the humanities, but that's really in our minds. And you and I know I have noticed that science students very much want to engage in artistic activities, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very enriching experience, just as I have found as a scientist, someone who's trained as an ecologist, biologist in different disciplines, that just living in that science world alone is not the richest place to be, but seeing how they integrate is very valuable. Now, they do offer, both of them offer extremely valuable ways of perceiving and knowing. And one without the other is fine, but when you have these different ways of perceiving and knowing blended, it just makes a much richer environment, and the arts feeds off the sciences feeds off the arts, and so much of it is based initially on just our observations of the world around us. So, as a scientist, I remember this diagram that was put up on a board. It was in wildlife research design, I believe, and the professor wrote truth model on top of the board, chalkboard. Imagine that. Truth model, he had it in quotes, just suggesting that this is just one way of even thinking about it. And he drew a dashed line down the center of the board. And then on the left side, he wrote the subjective realm of the thinking mind, or the scientist. And on the right side of the dashed line, he wrote the objective realm of nature and all the natural phenomena. And again, it was just one way of having a discussion about what science is. And on the left side, he drew an eyeball underneath the subjective world of the scientist, for example. And then he drew an arrow from the right side across, and as soon as that line hit this dashed line, that solid line became a dashed line into the eyeball that was drawn on the board. And right at that point where the observations that are coming into us cross that imaginary membrane, our senses, he wrote bias. And it's like, okay, so we're sitting here looking around at these trees and listening to birds, and I can perceive these things through my senses, but I might have an interpretation that is based on prior experience that could be very well be biased. So how am I going to study this all and get the best possible information? Well, in the sciences, you have methods to minimize or reduce bias. It rarely can you ever remove bias. It's just very challenging. This is why the techniques that we have are: one, a literature review. What kind of research has been done on a particular natural phenomenon? Two, a research design. How to set up a research design where you have controls, or it depends. There's a lot of different scientific designs, whether it's a field study versus an experiment. but you develop a way to measure things that allows you to draw comparisons or ask questions of what the underlying mechanism is for a particular phenomenon. So literature review, research design, and then the third one is techniques and skills. Learning how to set a net, learning how to sample water quality, learning how in the lab to measure water quality characteristics and such. And so those techniques and skills are very important. So literature review, research design, technical skills. And then the fourth one is critical thinking. And of course, critical thinking is extremely important. You know, you can read a report and it's like, well, is there interpretation within the bounds, for example, of the breadth of the study for a particular area? Are they trying to reach too far or not? Scientists are pretty good about that, and science is a self-correcting mechanism. If someone finds something new and interesting, you can bet there's going to be several other scientists trying to repeat the study to see if the findings are similar. If things don't seem right, it could be an outlier, but sometimes those outliers are interesting. They show us some new phenomenon maybe we don't quite understand as much. So those four things, literature review, research design, techniques and skills, and critical thinking. Now, some would add, and I would add this too, is creative thinking. You know, and creativity is the highest point on Bloom's taxonomy. And I can most definitely say this when you're thinking about a research design, thinking creatively. If someone comes to you and says, this is how much money and how much time you have, it's like, oh, okay, what kind of design can I create to give me the best answer possible with these limited resources? So that's where the creativity comes in. What is it and science really, in many ways, tries to ask, it starts off, what do we know, what don't we know, and what do we need to know? If you're working in an agency, maybe it's not necessary to know everything, but what do we need to know to move forward? So, in a nutshell, that's kind of a scientific approach to learning not perceiving, but learning and knowing about the world around us. Now, in contrast to that, so that's a very rigid approach. In contrast to that way of knowing, are other ways of perceiving and knowing, which can include, for example, a lot of different contemplative practices. It includes the arts, music. If I were to poetry, if I were to go sit in the woods, it's like, okay, I'm going to this place that I've studied salamanders or leaf litter depth or something like that. And I go out and sitting at that study site and just sit quietly and listen. I might get a whole different sense about the location. A poet, for example, tries to put into words, which is something that's very difficult to put into words. And a lot of it comes out of that space, which I've learned is really the organizing principle behind all of this and how things are situated. An artist, how would an artist perceive that particular location? In many respects, the artist is trying to enter in a place where the narrow bounds of self fall away. It's like, okay, I am no longer separate from this, but I am a part of this, and I can feel it on a very deep level. And that contrasts with the scientist who is trying to objectively separate and stand outside and look into the natural world. And sometimes that's very important, but it's also equally important and valid to enter into this space and perceiving it in a completely different way. And it's amazing how some scientists have their greatest insights through some meditative practice, such as walking or sitting in the woods or who knows what, sitting in a boat in the middle of the lake playing a violin, things such as that. So those are two very complementary ways of getting to understand our place in the world, how we fit in. The one last thing I can say about that, as someone who studied biology and ecology and worked in the environmental sciences and so forth, I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in the sciences. And about 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more, I was feeling like I was missing something. And I decided to go back and get a Master of Fine Arts in writing, as both poetry and creative nonfiction. And suddenly it was my interest in the sciences just was renewed and elevated as a result of getting my MFA. How does that happen? It's because I could see how well they complemented each other, and how wonderful that feeling was to be reinvigorated all over again. And it's not too much of a surprise that there's some places here in the United States, these long-term ecological research sites also have integrated into them long-term ecological reflections, where they invite poets and artists to sit at their long-term sites and write their essays or poems or paintings, and archiving those just like you would archive data. So it's really kind of a wonderful thing. And in my teaching previously here at Paul Smith College, I was always pleasantly surprised, and I don't know why I should have been, that students in the sciences had also a strong interest, whether they knew it or not, in some aspect of the humanities, often creative writing and abstracting nature as an art class, for example. So it's good all the way around. So that's how I would describe whatever the question, answer the question.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And just to kind of pull this together, in many ways, I think you're returning us to that moment in our sort of Western intellectual history, that moment in the Renaissance around Galileo's time, when actually we started to make those hard divisions between disciplines. But Galileo himself was a person who lived in all of those spaces. Master mathematician, intuitive scientist. Okay, helped to develop our modern scientific method in all those ways. But he was also a wonderful lute player, and his dad was a composer. Okay, and his dad was a composer who was pushing some of the norms and definitions of what tuning meant in music at that time. And so the young Galileo, grew up with a dad, Vincenzo, who, in Vincenzo's own discipline of music, he was questioning the norms, and he was pushing the bodies of knowledge and creating new mechanisms to make music in these tuning systems. And of course, Galileo would grow up later to do that in the sciences and actually change our idea of how the universe is put together.
Glenn, there's so many examples of that too, and I'll just share one. When color theory started being explored, about the time the expressionistic painters were coming into existence, like Monet. Some of the painters at that time were really becoming interested in color theory, and so there you have it.
Yeah.
Look at a Monet painting; it's like, wow, this is incredible. Even later on in life, when his eyesight was going bad, his interest in color theory didn't diminish.
Yeah.
As he painted his lily pond over and over and over again.
Yeah. Well, and also your point earlier about the fact that more and more science institutions are actually taking the arts quite seriously. For example, the Polar Division of the National Science Foundation, has an Artists and Writers Fellowship, right? That has been going for a generation, or more, and so I think this is a good reminder for us that scientists and artists and musicians certainly can be in dialogue with each other to help each other understand stuff. But even more than that, the scientist can be a musician, and the musician can be a scientist. Okay, we can embody that within ourselves. And so thank you for the insights today.
Oh, well, you're very welcome.